We are taking a step back in this episode and talking about some of the progress I skipped over before. We have been looking at large scale features with the world generation. Now it's time to turn our focus to blocks and make some new block types. First, we're going to look at texturing a standard block. This may seem trivial, and it would be if we were using cubes, but unfortunately we have this pesky hexagon that makes everything a lot harder. Some blocks this isn't much of an issue, as with this log, but if we want a seamless texture, there are a few tricks we need to pull. Okay, so here is a generic stone texture. This isn't a game texture, just something good for this example, as it will be easy to see bad seams with it. If I turn on pattern preview, we can see it's a perfect seamless texture. This means the left side and right side perfectly align, as well as the top and the bottom. I have added that texture to a test block. As we place it down in the world, you can see from the side it is working just fine, as you would expect. However, if we place them down on the floor, you can see there are these abrupt changes between the block's edges. Going back to Photoshop to visualize the problem, I have created this hexagon which shows us the UV layout for the top and bottom of our block. UVs are just a way of telling the shader how to draw the texture. They show us how the texture will be placed in-game. You can see that not all the texture is used, and we will have waste areas on the left and right. If I zoom out, you can see the problem. The tiled texture needs each hexagon to be separated, but the hexagons in-game are all touching, with opposite edges sharing a seam. Instead of the texture being seamless, we need the opposite edges of the hexagon to be seamless. We need the two side edges marked in green to be seamless, as well as the two pairs of diagonal edges marked in red and blue. How do we do this? There are a few ways to explain this, but I think this explanation is the best, as it is more visual. Taking a look at the hexagon dimensions first, if we make the long diameter of the hexagon and the size of our texture as one unit, what does this mean for the other dimensions? The edge of the hexagon is easy to calculate. This is just 0.5 units. You need to do a bit of trigonometry to work out the short diameter, but this turns out to be the square root of 3 divided by 2, making the margin to the edge of the texture to be 1 minus the square root of 3 divided by 2, all divided by 2, as there is a margin at each side. Using those measurements, I have added some guides that split the hexagon up into 8 cells. If we compare the cells, you can see that the bottom left cell shares the same edge as the top right cell, and the bottom right cell shares the same edge as the top left cell. So if these cells all contain the same texture, the hexagon's diagonal edges will all be seamless. Also, the middle left cell's edge needs to match the middle right cell's right edge. I am now drawing a perimeter around the bottom left 3 cells. Hopefully you can see, if we make a texture the size and shape of these 3 cells and then tile it, this will give us a texture that will be seamless for our hexagon, as all those conditions I just mentioned will be met. If we circle back to the dimensions of our hexagon, this makes the repeating cell the square root of 3 divided by 4 wide and 0.75 units tall. My textures are 512 by 512 pixels, so for that resolution we need a texture that has a width of 222 pixels and a height of 384 pixels. I have copied that section of the original texture into a new file. If I turn on pattern preview, you can see it is not seamless. Let me fix that quickly. The texture is now seamless, but before we copy it back to our other file, I'm going to draw a spiral in the bottom third of the image, as this is the area where we have all those diagonal seams. This should prove without doubt that the new texture is perfectly seamless. Back to our 512 by 512 pixel file. I'm going to delete the old texture now and paste in our new seamless texture into the bottom left 3 cells. Now, if I duplicate the texture to tile it, we should end up with a perfect tiling hexagonal texture. Back to the game, I have added the new texture into the voxel manager. You can see that it takes 2 different textures, one for the top and one for the sides of the blocks, as we need to use our original seamless texture for the block sides, but our new texture is for the top and bottom. The moment of truth. Does it work? The sides work just like before, but now, when we look down from above, you can't see any seams. In fact, if I make the area large enough, it's very hard to tell where one block ends and another starts. If I zoom in as close as I can into the spiral, you can see that it lines up perfectly, proving that this is a perfectly seamless hexagonal texture. Next, I want to talk about block shapes. Until now, you've just seen full blocks. Well, perhaps you spotted some of the grass cards too, like these, but I haven't really talked about them. The first logical and easy block to add is a half slab, just like this. Although the slab itself is super easy to code, it actually opens up a whole new can of worms, as not only can you place a slab on the bottom half of a block, but you can place it on the top half of a block too. The solution to this coincides with dyed blocks, and understanding them will help me explain the solution for slabs. You have to remember that we have to be very efficient with memory. The less memory each individual block takes up, the more blocks we can have loaded. This is not due to performance reasons, but rather how much memory your computer has. For example, if we want a draw distance of 1 kilometer, that means we need 1000 blocks in each direction from the player loaded. This is 2000 by 2000 blocks with an area of 4 million blocks. Now, if you remember, the world depth is 512 blocks, so that gives us a total of 2 billion blocks loaded. If each of those blocks takes up a small amount of memory, let's say 1 kilobyte, something so small you wouldn't even bother deleting it off your phone to free up space, that means we would need at minimum 2 terabytes of RAM to open the world, something that not even the most extreme custom PC could handle. So, we need to minimize how much memory each block takes up. I chose 2 bytes for each block. Now this means that a 1 kilometer draw distance now only use 4 gigabytes of RAM, which is much more manageable. However, 2 bytes is not a lot to work with. That's only 16 ones and zeros, and at most we can encode 65,536 different block states. Now here comes the problem with slabs. If we were to store the data normally, imagine we use 1 byte to store the block type and a bool, which is another byte, to store whether the slab is at the top or the bottom. That's already 2 bytes. If we now want to store the block's color too, that's another 3 bytes, and we're now over budget at 5 bytes of memory. So how do I cram all that information into 2 bytes? Firstly, a bool is really inefficient for data storage. It has 8 bits when it really only needs 1. Normally this doesn't matter, but it does here. So instead of storing the data as a separate bool, let's reserve 1 bit for if the block is flipped. As for the color, there is no way we can have 24-bit color. I decided instead to reserve 4 bits for color, meaning that we can have 16 different colors. Finally, I also want the ability for blocks to be rotated. There are 6 different ways you can rotate a hexagon, so that's another 3 bits, giving us a total of 8 bits, or 1 byte, for the rotational and color information, leaving us with just 1 byte for the block type. I felt that 1 byte for block type wasn't enough, as this leaves us only able to have 256 different blocks, not including color variations. So instead, I decided to overlap the rotation and flipping 4 bits with the color bits. This leaves us with 12 bits for block types, or 4096 different blocks, which is a lot better. However, it does now mean that any block that is dyed can no longer be rotated or flipped, meaning we can't have dyed slabs or stairs. Looking at the code of how this all works, I have a struct called voxel that contains all the information for a block. This is all set by the voxel manager and stored in a dictionary at runtime for the game to quickly access. I use an unsigned short to store the voxel ID. This is a number between 0 and 4095. It's unique for every block. There is then a bunch of enums which store all the block properties. Geometry sets the block shape. Opacity sets how the block will be shaded. Occluder type dictates how the block should affect other blocks. A standard block will occlude all other blocks it touches, but for example, a water block will only occlude itself, and a leaf block will occlude nothing. Textures, I will come back to that later, but it has to do with things like grass blocks, which have a different top and bottom texture. Color masking is what I use when I either want to tint a block or use the 16 standard dyes we were talking about. Sound will affect what a block is like to walk on or the sound it makes when it breaks. This doesn't work yet. Metadata will be used for special blocks like a chest, which need an inventory, but this also hasn't been done yet. Finally, there is a properties flag which adds a bunch more settings for a block, like if a block can be rotated, or with slabs, if they can be flipped. The most important enum we have is the type. This stores every different block we have in the game and will be expanded upon. But this is the voxel ID we use to store the block in memory. It has to be a number between 0 and 4095. So, how do I combine the block type with its state information? To do this, I use bit shifting and masking. When a voxel is read from memory, its state and block type are combined, so they need to be unpacked. To get the state, I just bit shift the value by 12 to get the 4 state bits, leaving with a number from 0 to 15. If you don't know what bit shifting is, all it does is move each bit a set number of positions to the left or right. You can think of it the same way as moving the decimal point with a normal number. If you have 1000 and move the decimal points 3 places to the left, you now have 1. It's the same for bit shifting, but in base 2 instead of base 10. I then use bit masking to get the voxel type. The AND operator here sets all the bits from the state to 0, while preserving all the block type bits. This leaves us with a number from 0 to 4095, which is the ID of our voxel. Finally, when we are wanting to store a block back to memory, we recombine the voxel ID and its state, this time bit shifting the state back to the last 4 bits. Once a voxel is unpacked, we load its properties from the voxel dictionary using its ID and store it temporarily while we update the chunk. Once the chunk is updated, all this information is disposed, so our computers don't run out of memory. Wow, so that was a lot of complexity for something at the surface level that seems so simple. But now we can simply set this flag if we want a block to be dyed, and we get 16 different colors for the price of one block. And for slabs, we can set the flipping flag so you can place them at the top or the bottom of a block. Here are all the different block colors we currently have. I may change them slightly in the future, but I like the current palette. I have this special debug block, which I can use to show you how rotation works. The arrow on top will always point towards the player as you place it. It can also be flipped. This episode really got away from me. I wanted to talk about some more interesting blocks, like mesh blocks, fences, and stairs, but I'll save that for the next episode. Let me know in the comments if you enjoy me going into the finer details of how it all works, or if you would prefer for me to stay to big picture stuff and not get too caught up in the weeds. Remember, if you're enjoying this series, the best two things you can do to help are to subscribe here on YouTube and to add PlanetSmith to your Steam wishlist. Links are in the description. We also have a Discord where you can find other people excited about PlanetSmith, and this is the best place to ask me questions or to share your ideas. Thank you to our YouTube members. Your support really helps me make these videos and is great motivation. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.